Mayfair, London. Spring, 1873. Sunlight spills across the marble steps of Hawthorne House in Grosvenor Square. Carriages line the street. Silk rustles. Fans flutter like nervous wings. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb stands in ivory silk. Her gloves are white. Her chin is lifted. Her hands do not tremble. The whispers do. Whitcomb's disgrace. The girl who ruined Lord Percival Ashford. Sold her honor for influence. The words travel through the crowd like smoke. No one speaks them loudly. No one needs to. Eleanor keeps her gaze forward. She will not search for friendly faces. She knows there are none. A few paces behind her, elevated on the highest step, stands His Grace, Duke Alistair Hawthorne of Ravenshollow. Dark uniform, polished metals, white gloves. He does not look at her. He does not look at them. He looks past them, unmoved, unapologetic. The most calculating nobleman in London has chosen to marry a woman society has already condemned. A scandal in silk. A fallen name at his side. The murmurs grow louder. And yet the Duke does not step away. Why would he bind himself to disgrace? Why would he claim what others have cast aside? The bells begin to ring, and Mayfair waits for ruin. If this moment unsettled you even slightly, don't scroll away. Stay with Eleanor. Her disgrace is only the beginning, and trust me, you do not want to miss why the Duke chose her. If you're drawn to stories of power, scandal, and dangerous alliances, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you want to see how this ends. 3 weeks earlier, the drawing room of the Whitcomb townhouse was heavy with perfume and expectation. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished floors. Conversations moved easily. Tea was poured. Futures were assumed. Lord Percival Ashford stood beside Lady Eleanor Whitcomb. Their engagement had been announced in winter. Their union was spoken of as inevitable. He cleared his throat. The room quieted. His voice was steady. Too steady. He thanked the Whitcomb family for their hospitality. He praised Eleanor's intelligence, her grace, her upbringing. Then he ended it. The engagement, he said, could not proceed. Gasps fluttered across the room. Eleanor did not move. Percival did not look at her as he continued. He spoke of misunderstandings, of irreconcilable concerns, of disturbing discoveries. That was the word that shifted everything. Discoveries. By morning, Mayfair knew. By afternoon, it had decided. By evening, it had judged. The accusations arrived in whispers first, then in ink. She had manipulated financial agreements tied to Ashford's railway investments in the north. She had altered figures to favor her own family's interests. She had leaked private correspondence between Ashford and influential industrial backers. She had undermined his parliamentary ambitions just weeks before a crucial vote on rail expansion and foreign trade. Signed documents appeared. Copies circulated discreetly through clubrooms and salons. Ink signatures, sealed envelopes, ledgers with corrections in a woman's hand. They said it was Eleanor's handwriting. The timing was surgical. Ashford had been preparing to present his support for a bill that would grant extended rail monopolies to a consortium of investors. The vote was to take place within the fortnight. Now he stood humiliated, withdrawn from consideration, a man publicly betrayed by his intended bride. Sympathy poured toward him. Suspicion hardened around her. At a dinner hosted by Lady Penrith, a woman whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Ambition in a woman is dangerous when it exceeds her understanding." At White's Club, men shook their heads gravely over brandy. The Whitcomb girl aimed above her station, one muttered, and miscalculated. Invitations to Eleanor's mother stopped arriving. Sir Thomas Whitcomb received curt letters requesting clarification. No one asked Eleanor directly. They did not need her explanation. The papers spoke for her. On the third day after the broken engagement, a formal statement was issued by Ashford's solicitor. It confirmed the existence of documented interference and declared the engagement dissolved on moral grounds. Eleanor read the statement in silence. Her mother wept. Her father paced. Sir Thomas's voice trembled with fury. "You will deny this immediately." Eleanor folded the paper carefully. "No," she said. The word fell softly, but it did not waver. Lady Margaret gripped her daughter's hand. "Eleanor, child, you must defend yourself. This will follow you forever." Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the fire. "If I speak," she replied quietly, "it will only worsen matters." Sir Thomas stopped pacing. "Worsen?" he demanded. "What could be worse than this?" Eleanor did not answer. Outside, carriage wheels rolled past, as though nothing had shifted. Inside Mayfair drawing rooms, her name hardened into caution. Within a week, she was no longer Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, promising bride of Lord Ashford. She was a lesson, a warning, a stain. And as Parliament prepared for the vote that would reshape Northern rail power, Lord Percival Ashford stepped back from public view. Disgraced, they said, but not by his own hand. The timing was too perfect, the documents too convenient, the fall too clean. And in the quiet between accusations, Eleanor Whitcomb said nothing at all.
Mayfair has a way of closing its doors without a sound. One morning, Eleanor's carriage waited outside the modiste on Bond Street. The seamstress sent word she was indisposed. The following afternoon, a luncheon invitation from Lady Harbury was rescinded with a polite note, a sudden indisposition, deep regret. By week's end, the Whitcomb household stood curiously still. No callers, no cards, no flowers, only silence. Servants moved carefully, as though loud footsteps might confirm what society had already decided. Lady Margaret Whitcomb sat near the window each morning, unopened letters resting in her lap. Her face, once animated by the small victories of social life, had grown pale. "This will pass," she murmured one evening, though her voice carried no conviction. "If we remain dignified, if we do not respond." Eleanor stood beside the fireplace, hands clasped lightly before her. "It has already settled," she replied softly. Lady Margaret's eyes shimmered. "Then we must let it settle. We must not agitate it further." Silence, in Mayfair, is often mistaken for guilt, but it is also protection. Sir Thomas Whitcomb did not share his wife's composure. He paced the study at all hours. Accounts lay open across his desk. Correspondence from business associates arrived with new restraint. The Whitcomb shipping interests were not vast, but they were respectable. Respectability was their currency. And currency, Sir Thomas knew, could evaporate faster than reputation. "If Ashford proceeds formally," he said one night, voice taut, "there may be consequences beyond gossip." "Financial?" Lady Margaret asked. "Political," he answered, "which is worse." He turned to Eleanor. "You will issue a statement. You will deny these charges, publicly." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "No." The word was gentle, immovable. Sir Thomas's hands trembled with frustration. "Do you not understand what this costs us?" "Yes." "Then why persist in silence?" Eleanor stepped closer to the desk. She rested her fingertips lightly against the polished wood. "Because denial would demand explanation," she said, "and explanation would demand names." Lady Margaret inhaled sharply. Sir Thomas stared at her. "What names?" he pressed. Eleanor's gaze lowered briefly. "Names that would suffer more than mine." It was the closest she had come to justification, and it was not enough. The following week, her absence from social functions became its own announcement. At Hyde Park, women turned their heads when her carriage passed. At church, pews seemed to shift subtly away. Even former friends offered only cautious nods. A single whispered remark followed her through a reception at Lady Penrith's townhouse. If she were innocent, she would defend herself. Eleanor heard it. She did not turn. The silence became its own accusation. To some, it proved cunning. To others, pride. To many, it confirmed guilt. Within Parliament, Lord Percival Ashford's allies spoke gravely of betrayal, of compromised trust, of ambition misdirected. The Whitcomb name was no longer merely entangled in scandal, it was inconvenient.
Sir Thomas received a letter from a long-standing investor withdrawing tentative support for a northern shipping venture. Until clarity is restored, the man wrote. Clarity.
As though clarity were a commodity Eleanor could purchase. One evening, Lady Margaret entered her daughter's chamber without knocking. Eleanor stood at the window, watching lamplight bloom across Grosvenor Square. "Child," Lady Margaret whispered, "tell me only this. Are you protecting him?" Eleanor did not ask which him. She did not deny it. She did not confirm it. Instead, she turned slowly. "I am protecting what must not be destroyed," she said. Lady Margaret's hand fell to her side. "Then you are braver than society believes," she murmured. Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "Or more foolish." Outside, carriage wheels rolled on polished stone. Mayfair had closed its doors, and Eleanor Whitcomb remained within it, uninvited, unforgiven, unexplained. Her silence did not queer her name. It darkened it. And still, she said nothing. The accusation arrived not as gossip, but as parchment. A sealed notice bearing the crest of the crown was delivered to the Whitcomb townhouse on a gray morning thick with fog. Sir Thomas broke the seal with unsteady hands. A formal inquiry had been initiated by order of Viscount Edmund Blackmore, ally to Lord Percival Ashford, champion of industrial expansion in the north. The inquiry alleged that Lady Eleanor Whitcomb had interfered in trade negotiations tied to railway monopolies and foreign steel imports, that she had altered projected revenue statements, that she had misdirected correspondence between Ashford's office and investors in Manchester and Leeds. The language was careful, measured. It did not accuse her of emotional betrayal. It accused her of political sabotage. Sir Thomas lowered himself slowly into his chair. "This is no longer a broken engagement," he said quietly. Lady Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. Eleanor read the notice without visible reaction. Viscount Blackmore had requested her presence at a private review in Westminster within the fortnight. Documents would be examined, handwriting compared, financial ledgers scrutinized. The rail expansion bill stood at the center of it all. The proposal would grant Ashford's consortium unprecedented control over northern routes. Land acquisitions were already underway. Investors waited with quiet impatience. And now, the integrity of those negotiations had been called into question, not by a rival politician, by the former bride. Society shifted. What had been a romantic disgrace sharpened into something colder, dangerous. At White's Club, men no longer spoke of wounded pride, they spoke of destabilized markets. At Parliament, Blackmore delivered a grave address on the sanctity of economic trust. He did not name Eleanor directly. He did not need to. Mayfair understood the implication. If she had tampered with trade figures, if she had redirected correspondence, if she had exposed private investment strategies, then she was not merely ambitious, she was treacherous. The Whitcomb shipping interests began to feel the tremor. 2 contracts were postponed. A northern supplier withdrew quietly. Sir Thomas's voice grew hoarse from meetings that ended without resolution. "Blackmore does not pursue rumor," he muttered one evening. "He pursues advantage." Eleanor stood by the hearth, listening. The flames reflected faintly in her eyes. "What advantage?" Lady Margaret whispered. Sir Thomas hesitated. "The rail bill is contested. There are factions who believe monopolizing the northern routes will shift too much power into one circle of men." "And Eleanor?" Lady Margaret asked. "She is leverage," Sir Thomas replied. Silence fell heavy. Eleanor stepped forward. "Viscount Blackmore does not seek justice," she said calmly. "He seeks alignment." Sir Thomas looked at her sharply. "With whom?" Eleanor did not answer. The inquiry gained momentum. Newspapers avoided direct accusation, but editorials questioned the wisdom of entrusting sensitive economic correspondence to inexperienced hands. Her youth became evidence. Her education,
suspicion. A rumor spread that she had dined privately with a foreign attaché. Untrue, but plausible enough. The narrative had shifted.
She was no longer the girl who embarrassed a fiancé. She was the woman who threatened infrastructure. At a reception in Westminster, Blackmore was overheard remarking, "The integrity of the empire rests on disciplined negotiation, not impulsive sentiment." The implication was clear. Eleanor Whitcomb had endangered more than a marriage. She had endangered momentum, and momentum in 1873 meant wealth, power, control. The timing of the inquiry was precise. The rail vote approached. Ashford remained publicly withdrawn. Blackmore stood visible and composed. And somewhere beneath the careful orchestration of accusation and inquiry, something larger began to stir. The scandal was no longer about Eleanor's character. It was about control of the North. And Eleanor, silent as ever, allowed the accusation to settle like ash, as though she had expected the fire to spread. The fracture did not come with raised voices. It came with paper. A packet of private letters surfaced 2 days before the scheduled inquiry. No official seal, no explanation of origin, only copies, precise, deliberate copies, delivered discreetly to 3 prominent households and 1 editorial office. The contents were incendiary. Correspondence between Lord Percival Ashford and foreign steel magnates in Antwerp and Hamburg. Negotiations outlining preferential tariffs. Promises of exclusive Northern Rail contracts. Clauses suggesting foreign capital would quietly secure land adjacent to key industrial routes before Parliament voted. The language was careful. The ambition was not. If authentic, the letters suggested Ashford's consortium intended to consolidate not merely railways, but supply chains. Control steel and 1 controlled rail. Control rail and 1 controlled movement. Power without uniform. Influence without crown. The implication rippled through London before noon. Blackmore did not comment publicly. Ashford issued a brief statement denying impropriety. The inquiry, however, gained urgency. Eleanor sat in the Whitcomb drawing room as Sir Thomas read aloud from a printed summary circulating among select members of Parliament. "These letters," he said slowly, "shift suspicion from you." Lady Margaret pressed her hands together in relief. Sir Thomas looked up. "Do they not?" Eleanor remained standing near the window, light falling across her shoulders. "They shift attention," she replied. "That is enough," Sir Thomas insisted. "If Ashford's dealings are questioned, your supposed interference appears less malicious." Lady Margaret stepped forward. "You must present this to Viscount Blackmore, at once." Eleanor's gaze moved to the small writing desk beside her. Upon it lay a single envelope, sealed, unopened. It had arrived that morning. Sir Thomas followed her line of sight. "What is that?" Eleanor did not hesitate. Something that should not exist. She crossed the room with measured steps. Her fingers broke the seal. Inside lay a letter written in Ashford's hand, not to investors, to someone unnamed. The tone was colder than ambition. It detailed a contingency. If the rail bill encountered resistance, pressure would be applied through financial exposure of certain shipping interests, smaller firms, vulnerable ones. Whitcomb Shipping was mentioned, indirectly, but unmistakably. Sir Thomas's breath stilled. Lady Margaret sank into a chair. Eleanor read the lines once, then again. No tremor passed through her. Sir Thomas's voice shook. "This proves coercion. It proves intent to damage us. It clears you entirely." He stepped toward her. "Eleanor, this is your defense." She folded the letter carefully. "It is more than that." "Yes," Sir Thomas snapped. "It is our survival." The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Eleanor walked toward it. Lady Margaret rose abruptly. "Child, what are you doing?" Eleanor held the letter over the flames. "For the rail bill to fracture," she said quietly, "Ashford must remain credible long enough to stand exposed." Sir Thomas stared at her. "You speak as though you know how this unfolds." The edge of the parchment darkened. "You cannot protect him," Lady Margaret whispered, "after what he has done." Eleanor's eyes remained on the curling ink. "I am not protecting him." The paper caught. Flame climbed slowly across the script.
You are protecting his power, Sir Thomas accused. Eleanor released the letter. It fell into the fire, blackened, gone. Silence filled the room. Sir Thomas stepped back as though struck. You have destroyed proof, he said hoarsely, proof that would absolve you. Eleanor turned from the hearth.
If that letter surfaces now, it ends him quietly. The vote collapses. Another faction rises, one equally eager to control the North. Her voice was steady. And we would remain a convenient scapegoat. Lady Margaret's hands trembled. Then what do you intend? Eleanor met her mother's gaze. To let the fracture widen. Sir Thomas's jaw tightened. By sacrificing yourself? Eleanor did not answer. Outside, carriage wheels rolled past as though nothing had shifted. Inside, the air felt thinner. Rumors intensified as the letters between Ashford and foreign investors circulated more widely. Blackmore requested expedited review. Parliament whispered of oversight committees and foreign influence. Eleanor's silence grew heavier. Now there was evidence that could have cleared her, and she had burned it. In Mayfair drawing rooms, speculation turned sharp. If she were innocent, she would seize the opportunity, unless she fears deeper exposure.
Perhaps she was involved more deeply than we believed. Doubt shifted. It no longer circled Ashford alone. It circled her again. Why destroy leverage? Why shield the very man who cast her aside? Unless she had something to hide. By evening, even Sir Thomas's confidence had thinned. He stood at the study window, staring into Grosvenor Square. You gamble with reputation as though it were coin, he said quietly. Eleanor stood beside him. Reputation is coin, she replied, and coin buys time. For whom? She did not look at him. For the one who can afford the larger purchase. Sir Thomas turned slowly. Who is that? But Eleanor offered no name, only silence, and the faint scent of ash lingering in the room. The fracture had begun, and she had chosen not to mend it. The summons arrived at dusk. No crest of Parliament, no flourish of official inquiry, only the unmistakable seal of Ravenshollow. Sir Thomas stared at the wax impression before breaking it. His expression shifted, not to relief, but to caution. Eleanor read the brief message in silence. His Grace, Duke Alistair Hawthorne of Ravenshollow, requests the presence of Lady Eleanor Whitcomb at Hawthorne House tomorrow evening. No explanation, no courtesy beyond precision. Lady Margaret pressed her hand to her throat. He has not spoken your name once in public, she said, not in defense, not in condemnation. Eleanor folded the letter. I know. The following evening, her carriage crossed Grosvenor Square beneath a sky bruised with fading light. Hawthorne House stood severe against the twilight. Marble steps, tall windows, curtains drawn with exact symmetry. A residence that did not perform wealth, it assumed it. Eleanor was led through a hall of muted gold and dark wood. Footsteps echoed softly beneath vaulted ceilings. She was not received in a drawing room. She was taken directly to the study. The door closed behind her with measured finality. Duke Alistair Hawthorne stood near the tall window overlooking the square. The lamplight caught the edge of his medals. His uniform was immaculate, his posture unyielding. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer condolences. He did not mention the scandal. Lady Eleanor, he said evenly. Your Grace. Silence stretched, deliberate. From the window, Grosvenor Square lay calm. Carriages moved like quiet pieces on a board. You have allowed the inquiry to advance, he observed. Yes. You burned a document that would have shifted the narrative. Eleanor did not startle. I did. His gaze remained fixed beyond the glass. Most would have seized the opportunity. Most would have misunderstood the cost. A faint shift crossed his expression. Not approval, not surprise. Recognition. You understand cost, then. I understand leverage. The Duke turned slowly to face her. His eyes were steady, unreadable. Viscount Blackmore believes the inquiry will fracture Ashford's circle and strengthen his own.
And will it? Eleanor asked. Temporarily. The words settled between them. Eleanor studied him. You did not summon me to discuss Blackmore. No. He crossed the room with measured steps, each movement controlled. Your silence has achieved what denial could not, he continued. You have allowed factions to reveal themselves. And you have been watching. Always. There was no arrogance in the word, only fact. He stopped a measured distance from her. You will not survive this unshielded, he said. Eleanor lifted her chin. I have survived worse than whispers. This is not about whispers. He reached the desk and opened a single leather-bound folder. He did not hand it to her. Rail corridors bordering Ravenshallow lands are under quiet negotiation. Foreign capital seeks influence. Blackmore seeks parliamentary control. Ashford seeks survival. And you? She asked softly. I seek permanence. The word carried weight.
Outside, a carriage rolled past. The sound faded quickly. I will not defend you publicly, he said. I did not expect you to. I will not clear your name. I know. His gaze sharpened slightly. I will marry you. The room did not shift. Eleanor did not move. Her breathing remained even. As what? She asked. As Duchess of Ravenshallow. The words were not romantic. They were architectural. Why? She asked. Because your disgrace consolidates my position. There was no cruelty in his tone, only clarity. Society will call it opportunistic, she said. They will call it many things. And you? I call it arrangement. Silence followed. He did not approach further. He did not soften. This marriage will redirect the inquiry, he continued. It will fracture Blackmore's advantage. It will stabilize northern interests under my influence. And my role? She asked. To stand beside me. Silently. When required. Eleanor's eyes held his. And if I refuse?
You will face Parliament alone. There was no threat in it, only probability. She stepped toward the window, looking out across the square. Marriage, she said quietly, is rarely proposed without illusion. I offer none. Affection, unnecessary. Reputation, temporary. She turned back to him, and in exchange, he met her gaze without hesitation. Influence beyond scandal. The words lingered. She considered them. You do not seek to rescue me, she said. No. You seek to bind me. Yes. The honesty did not wound. It clarified. Eleanor walked slowly back toward him. And if the inquiry deepens, she asked, it will. And if Ashford falls, he will. And Blackmore. The faintest shadow crossed his features.
He underestimates what answers to my name. Silence settled again. The arrangement hung between them. No vows, no tenderness, only structure. Very well, Eleanor said at last. The Duke inclined his head. No hand was extended, no promise spoken. The terms remained unvoiced, but understood. The announcement was delivered without ornament, a single printed notice. His Grace Duke Alastair Hawthorne of Ravenshallow is pleased to confirm his forthcoming marriage to Lady Eleanor Whitcomb. Mayfair did not gasp, it sharpened. Rumors already fevered, ignited fully. At Lady Harbury's music halley, a woman laughed too brightly. The Duke always did prefer acquisitions with advantage. At White's Club, a barrister murmured, Hawthorne buys influence at a discount. Others speculated more boldly. He humiliates Parliament. He mocks the inquiry. He asserts dominance over Blackmore. The theory most often repeated was the simplest. The Duke had seized a damaged bride cheaply. A fallen name was easier to control. Eleanor heard each version with composed silence. She did not correct them. She did not deny them. Hawthorne House grew busier. Carriages arrived at hours that suggested negotiation rather than celebration. Northern land agents were received discreetly. Two steel magnates, previously aligned with Ashford's consortium, were seen entering Ravenshallow's London office. Blackmore's tone in Parliament shifted. He remained composed, but his speeches grew shorter, more defensive. The inquiry, once urgent, slowed under procedural revisions. A committee member withdrew on grounds of prior association. Another declared conflicting interests. Small signs, subtle, but unmistakable. Ashford's rail bill faltered in debate. Supporters who had once spoken confidently began requesting amendments. Foreign investors, whose names had circulated privately, sent representatives to renegotiate terms. Withdrawals occurred quietly. No scandal attached.
Only delay. In Grosvenor Square, Eleanor stood beside Duke Alastair during a reception hosted in their honor. The crowd watched for tension, for resentment, for evidence of coercion. They saw none. The Duke did not hover. He did not restrain. He stood slightly apart, conversing with a northern industrialist while Eleanor greeted Lady Penrith without flinching. A murmur passed behind them. He marries scandal and emerges stronger. Another voice replied, or he marries it because he is stronger. The distinction mattered. Blackmore attended the reception. He bowed with exact politeness. "Your Grace," he said smoothly. "Viscount," the Duke replied. Blackmore's gaze lingered briefly on Eleanor. "A bold alliance," he remarked. "Necessary," Alastair answered. "For whom?" "For permanence." The word held. Blackmore inclined his head. Later that evening, word spread that two key backers of the rail monopoly had withdrawn public support for Ashford's bill. Their stated reason: instability. No one mentioned the marriage, but no one ignored it either. Sir Thomas Whitcomb, once pale with worry, found new invitations arriving. Cautious, measured, but arriving nonetheless.
Lady Margaret observed the shift with quiet astonishment. "It is as though the air has altered," she murmured. "It has," Eleanor replied. Across London, newspapers adjusted their language. Where once they had printed disgrace, they now printed strategic union. Where once they had questioned Eleanor's interference, they now questioned Blackmore's oversight. Ashford attempted a brief return to public view. The reception was cool. His trade bill, once inevitable, collapsed in committee review amid calls for expanded transparency. No dramatic downfall, no scandalous exposure, only erosion. Investors withdrew pending clarification. Clarification never arrived. Within weeks, alliances that had appeared immovable shifted quietly toward Ravenshallow. Northern land adjacent to proposed rail corridors fell under the Duke's influence through indirect acquisition. Industrial contracts rebalanced. Mayfair observed the pattern slowly. Not a rescue, a recalibration. At a luncheon in Kensington, a dowager whispered, "He did not marry beneath himself." She paused. He married forward. Eleanor stood at Hawthorne House's tall window one evening, watching the square as dusk settled. The inquiry still existed, but it no longer threatened. Blackmore's speeches grew increasingly cautious. Ashford's name receded from headlines. The scandal that had once isolated her now shielded her. She had entered Ravenshallow under suspicion. She stood beside it under consolidation. The alignment was subtle. No grand declaration, no public triumph, only the quiet rearrangement of power. And beneath it all, something unmistakable moved. Not in Parliament, not in drawing rooms, but in the unseen channels where influence traveled without announcement. The whispers had not ceased. They had changed direction, and Mayfair, attentive as ever, began to understand. The Duke had not seized a damaged bride. He had absorbed a fracture, and the fracture had begun to serve him.
Exposure did not arrive in a single revelation. It came in fragments. A withdrawn investment here, a revised land deed there, a railway corridor quietly redirected 20 miles east of its original projection. Men in Parliament began to speak more cautiously of foreign influence, and in private, more urgently, of lost advantage. The rail monopoly proposal that had once promised Ashford sweeping control over northern routes now appeared riddled with complications. A confidential memorandum circulated among senior members of the committee questioned the exclusivity clauses embedded in the original drafts. It did not accuse, it implied. It asked why Antwerp steel shipments were guaranteed priority docking access at Hull under revised trade provisions. It asked why rail expansion lines seemed to intersect suspiciously with parcels recently purchased through intermediaries tied to Viscount Blackmore's associates. And it asked with delicate restraint whether foreign backers might hold leverage over domestic supply. Ashford denied knowledge. Blackmore condemned the memorandum as politically motivated, but the damage was precise. Investigative clerks began examining shipping registries. Land transfers were reviewed. Names surfaced. Not publicly, not yet. But in drawing rooms and parliamentary corridors, the pattern began to clarify. Ashford's negotiations with foreign steel magnates had not been limited to favorable pricing. They included future transport guarantees. Rail lines would carry steel exclusively from contracted suppliers. Competing northern manufacturers would be squeezed gradually. Blackmore's support for the rail bill, once framed as economic modernization, began to resemble something narrower, a consolidation. Manufacturing routes north of York would be redirected toward industrial centers aligned with his allies, and several of those projected routes bordered Ravenshallow estates, land owned by Duke Alistair Hawthorne, land that controlled access to key northern junctions. If Ashford's consortium secured the monopoly, if Blackmore secured parliamentary oversight, if foreign steel secured exclusive supply, then Ravenshallow would find itself encircled, dependent, contained. The realization did not erupt into scandal. It settled like frost. In Hawthorne House, Eleanor stood before the Duke's expansive desk as reports were laid out in orderly stacks. Shipping logs, land acquisition ledgers, letters traced back through secondary accounts. She studied them without visible triumph. "You see the pattern," Alistair said quietly.
Yes. Ashford had negotiated privately to secure backing from Antwerp steel exporters. Blackmore had maneuvered within Parliament to ensure the rail bill's passage. Together, they would command northern transport and manufacturing, and in that configuration, Ravenshallow's influence would diminish. Blackmore believed Ashford ambitious, Eleanor said. He did not consider him impatient. And Ashford believed Blackmore cautious, Alistair replied. He did not consider him acquisitive. The alliance between them had never been equal. It had been convenient. And convenience, when misjudged, fractures. The memorandum circulating quietly through Parliament had originated from no official source. It was unsigned, unattributed, but it had arrived at precisely the moment Ashford's bill weakened. Eleanor's fingers rested lightly on the edge of one page. Months earlier, before the engagement had dissolved, she had reviewed correspondence sent to Ashford's townhouse. She had noticed unfamiliar letterheads, foreign addresses, subtle variations in contract language. At first, she had assumed ambition. Then she had recognized pattern. Priority clauses embedded where none were needed. Transport guarantees extending beyond parliamentary review. Land parcels quietly transferred through shell accounts. She had confronted Ashford once. Not with accusation, with inquiry. He had smiled.
He had reassured. He had dismissed her concerns as youthful misunderstanding. And later that week, she had written a letter. Not to Parliament, not to Blackmore, to someone else. We do not yet know who. The response to that letter had been brief, measured. It had not instructed her to act. It had asked a question. How much are you willing to lose? Eleanor had considered the question carefully. When the engagement fractured publicly, society believed Ashford humiliated, but in truth, he had secured sympathy. It was Eleanor who absorbed disgrace. And in absorbing it, she severed the visible connection between herself and Ashford's circle. That severance had allowed scrutiny to grow without implicating Ravenshollow directly. Blackmore's initial inquiry, framed around Eleanor's supposed interference, had seemed a decisive move, but it had inadvertently exposed procedural weaknesses in the rail bill. His insistence on formal review had invited document examination. Document examination had revealed inconsistencies. Inconsistencies had invited doubt, and doubt, in Parliament, is corrosive.
At White's Club, murmurs shifted. Ashford negotiated too broadly.
Blackmore extended too far. No one accounted for Hawthorne. The Duke had remained publicly silent. He had not defended Eleanor. He had not condemned Ashford. He had simply announced marriage. And in doing so, he had redirected attention. Society assumed opportunism. Few recognized alignment. In a closed-door meeting near Westminster, a senior clerk noted quietly that projected rail corridors intersecting Ravenshallow lands would now require renegotiation under revised oversight standards. Renegotiation meant delay. Delay meant uncertainty. Foreign backers dislike uncertainty. They began withdrawing quietly. Ashford's investors thinned. Blackmore's coalition hesitated. Exposure did not require spectacle. It required clarity. And clarity had begun to spread.
One evening, as lamplight flickered across Grosvenor Square, Eleanor stood beside the Duke in the study. "You knew," he said. She did not ask what. "You saw the encirclement." "Yes." "And you warned someone." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes." He did not ask who. He did not need to. Outside, carriage wheels rolled across stone. Inside, the shape of the threat stood fully visible. Ashford had sought monopoly. Blackmore had sought control. Foreign investors had sought leverage, and Eleanor Whitcomb had chosen to fracture the alignment before it solidified. The cost had been her name. The benefit was still unfolding. Exposure had begun, not with scandal, with structure. And as Parliament recalculated, as investors reconsidered, as alliances thinned,
Mayfair began to understand that the girl they condemned had not acted from impulse. She had acted from foresight. The question that remained, the one still unspoken, was who had answered her letter, and what had moved in response.
The truth did not arrive gently. It arrived with precision. In a closed chamber at Westminster, before a select review committee, a series of documents was presented. Not copies, originals. Shipping manifests cross-referenced with rail projections, land deeds tied to intermediary firms, correspondence between Ashford's solicitor and Antwerp investors, and a memorandum linking those investors to shell acquisitions bordering Ravenshollow territory. The documents were not introduced by Blackmore. They were not submitted by Ashford. They bore no dramatic flourish. They simply appeared, and they were devastating. Ashford's rail monopoly proposal was formally suspended pending full investigation. Foreign investors withdrew entirely within days. Blackmore, forced to distance himself, publicly expressed regret for oversight. The fracture became collapse. Mayfair watched the reversal unfold with disbelief. The man once poised to control the North now stood exposed as reckless. The alliance that had threatened Ravenshallow disintegrated without spectacle, and at the center of it all stood Duke Alastair Hawthorne, unmoved, unapologetic. The whisper began quietly. He knew. The Duke had anticipated the encirclement. He had seen the quiet purchases, the foreign contracts, the intersecting rail corridors, and he had acted before the structure solidified. The partial letters that surfaced, the inquiry that shifted scrutiny, the careful delay in defending Eleanor, none had been accidental. In his study overlooking Grosvenor Square, Eleanor stood across from him as the final reports arrived. "You leaked the first fragments," she said softly. "Yes." "Enough to provoke inquiry, not enough to expose the full design." "Yes." "You guided Blackmore into pressing the investigation." "Yes."
And you allowed Ashford to believe he was still in control. The Duke's gaze did not waver. He was predictable. Silence stretched. Outside, London moved as it always did. Inside, the architecture of deception stood revealed. "You manipulated him into ending the engagement," Eleanor said. "I made him doubt your loyalty. You planted uncertainty. I magnified it." Ashford, ambitious and cautious in equal measure, had recoiled at the suggestion that Eleanor might question his foreign negotiations. He had feared exposure. He had chosen to sever ties publicly before vulnerability could be traced to him. The disgrace had followed swiftly, engineered, precise. The Duke had ensured Eleanor would be socially severed from a dangerous alliance before Ashford's monopoly consolidated. Had you remained engaged, Alistair said evenly, your name would have been absorbed into his network, and Ravenshallow would have been cornered, she replied. Yes. The room fell quiet. It would have been simple to call it rescue.
But it was not. It was strategy. The disgrace was not collateral damage. It was placement. Eleanor walked toward the window. Blackmore believed the inquiry his weapon, she said. He was given the illusion, Alistair answered. He exposed the rail structure himself. Yes. She turned slowly. And the letter I sent. The Duke regarded her carefully. You knew it would reach me. Yes. You asked how much I was willing to lose, and you answered. Eleanor's chin lifted. I was willing to lose my name. The deeper truth settled between them. He had engineered the initial fracture, but she had agreed to bear it. When she discovered Ashford's negotiations with foreign steel magnates, when she recognized Blackmore's interest in northern routes bordering Ravenshallow, when she understood that marriage would entangle her in a structure designed to contain the Duke, she had chosen silence.
She had chosen disgrace, not out of loyalty, but alignment. You could have refused, Alistair said quietly. Yes? You understood the cost. Yes? And still, Eleanor's voice remained steady. Parliament needed exposure, Ashford needed overconfidence, Blackmore needed momentum, and Ravenshallow needed insulation. Her eyes met his without tremor. The disgrace had provided all three. He regarded her for a long moment. No admiration, no surprise, only acknowledgement. The inquiry, she continued, diverted attention, while the true contracts were traced. The wedding, he added, consolidated the territory. Yes, the scandal that had once isolated her now shielded her position. Society believed the Duke had married beneath himself. In truth, he had secured leverage, and she had secured distance from corruption before it calcified around her. Mayfair would never know the full design. It would whisper of dominance,
of acquisition, of opportunism. But the deeper truth would remain unspoken. The disgrace had been bait. The inquiry, distraction. The marriage, consolidation. In Parliament, Ashford's ambitions dissolved under scrutiny. Blackmore retreated to quieter committees. Northern rail contracts were restructured under revised oversight. Foreign influence diminished. And Ravenshallow's estates remained sovereign in function, if not in title. Eleanor stepped closer to the Duke. "Did you trust me?" she asked softly. "To endure it." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you understood permanence." The word lingered again. Outside, bells rang faintly in the distance. A city unaware of the quiet war it had just witnessed. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "They believed I ruined a man." "They believed I exploited scandal," he replied. "They believed you claimed something broken. They believed what was useful." Silence returned. But it was no longer heavy. It was resolved. In Grosvenor Square, carriages moved as they always had. Society would adjust its narratives. History would reduce events to coincidence. But beneath the marble steps and polished speeches, the truth stood firm. He had engineered the fall. She had agreed to it. Together, they had fractured a structure that would have seized the North. And in doing so, they had rewritten the balance of power. Not loudly, not theatrically, but permanently.
Mayfair, London, spring 1873. The bells ring again, but this time the whispers are different. On the marble steps of Hawthorne House, Lady Eleanor Whitcomb stands in ivory silk. The same silk that once seemed like defiance. The same steps that once felt like judgment. The crowd has gathered in equal number,
but their eyes have changed. Where there was scandal, there is calculation. Where there was condemnation, there is caution. Blackmore stands among them, silent, composed. His expression reveals nothing, but he does not speak. He does not challenge. He does not move forward.
He understands now. Ashford stands farther back, near the carriages, removed from the inner circle of conversation. He watches the Duke. He does not look at Eleanor. He does not meet her eyes. The rail bill that once promised him dominion over Northern Passage now lies dismantled. Foreign steel magnates have withdrawn quietly. Shipping routes have been revised. Land once targeted by speculative acquisition now falls under Ravenshallow oversight. The North moves, but it moves through the Duke, and the Duke stands unmoved. His Grace Alastair Hawthorne of Ravenshallow does not perform triumph. He does not acknowledge defeat in others. He stands at the highest step, metals catching the late afternoon light. The golden rim of the sun rests along his shoulder, still, certain.
The inquiry has dissolved. Blackmore's influence has thinned. Ashford's ambition has been exposed as reckless. The monopoly that threatened Ravenshollow collapsed under its own concealed weight. And Eleanor does not bow her head. Not now, not ever again. She steps forward when summoned, not hesitantly, not as penance, but deliberately. Her father stands below, posture restored. Her mother's eyes glisten with something no longer fear. The Duke extends his hand, not tenderly, not possessively, simply as structure. Eleanor places her hand in his. The contact is firm, measured, witnessed. A murmur passes through the crowd. She survives. No, another replies softly. She prevails. Blackmore inclines his head.
The gesture is subtle. Respect or resignation? Perhaps both. Ashford turns away first. The weight of exposure rests heavier than disgrace. The ceremony concludes without spectacle. No dramatic declaration, no swelling proclamation, just the quiet consolidation of alliance. As guests disperse, conversation shifts. No longer about ruin, but about recalibration. A northern shipping magnate approaches the Duke. A steel manufacturer from Leeds offers congratulations. A land agent from York requests audience. All in measured tones, all aware of the altered terrain. Eleanor stands beside Alastair. Not slightly behind, not slightly apart. Beside. She listens as agreements are referenced indirectly, as rail passages are discussed without naming control, as influence travels through implication rather than announcement. She feels the structure now, understands it fully. The disgrace was never collapse, it was insulation. By severing her publicly from Ashford, she severed Ravenshallow from encirclement. By enduring accusation, she allowed scrutiny to redirect. By standing silent, she forced ambition into exposure. And by marrying the Duke, she transformed scandal into shield. The whispers continue, but they are softer, careful. One woman murmurs, "She was never naive." Another responds, "No, she was positioned." Eleanor allows herself a single breath of release. She had known the cost. She had chosen it. But standing here, on the marble steps, in full view of those who judged her,
She understands something deeper. Nothing in Mayfair moves without calculation. Nothing in Parliament rises without structure. Nothing in the North shifts without consequence. And nothing at all, moves without answering to Alastair Hawthorne. Not rail lines, not investors, not rival politicians, not whispered alliances, not even scandal. She turns slightly toward him. He does not look at her. He does not need to. The alignment is understood. He engineered the fracture. She embodied it. Together, they redirected the current. A carriage door closes in the distance. The square begins to empty. The golden light softens. Eleanor's voice is calm when she finally speaks.
It is finished.
Alistair's gaze remains fixed forward. "No," he says quietly, "it is stabilized. The distinction matters." She nods once. The Duke descends the steps. She descends beside him. Not as rescued bride, not as damaged acquisition, but as Duchess of Ravenshallow. Strategic, positioned, unbroken. The crowd parts instinctively. No command is spoken. None is needed. The path clears. And as carriage wheels begin to turn once more across Grosvenor Square, Eleanor understands the final truth. Her fall had not been accident. It had not been punishment. It had been placement, a necessary descent before elevation. Mayfair believed it had condemned her. In truth, it had crowned her, and nothing in London will forget it.